Good evening, everyone. My name's Philip Marshall. I'm Director of the London Library, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for tonight's event about censorship in the theatre. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion because censorship in the theatre ended 50 years ago with the Theatre Act, or did it? ? I think we'd like to hear your views on that later. I'd like to give a very special welcome to everyone who hasn't been to the library before, or perhaps even hadn't heard of the library before this evening. Congratulations, you are now in on one of London's greatest secrets. It is a treasure trove of 1 million books on 17 miles of shelves, open to browse and borrow from, so it's an incredible resource. Congratulations on finding us. It's a secret with a difference. You can tell as many people as you like, because we want to share this wonderful building and this wonderful collection with as many people as possible. This is the reading room is absolutely the right place to be holding this event, not least because it's the place we can get most people in, and this was an absolute sellout tonight, but also because the portrait above the fireplace there is of Mr. William Bodham Dunn, who was the second librarian of the library. He started in that role in 1852. And he was also a censor in the office of the Lord Chamberlain. So it would be interesting to think what he would have made of tonight's discussion. The library has been a very welcoming place for people connected to the theatre throughout its time. We were founded 177 years ago. In 1890, the great Victorian actor Henry Irving joined us. In 1891, his theatre manager at the Lyceum, Bram Stoker, joined us and spent 6 years here writing Dracula, or writing it from his home, using our books. Laurence Olivier was one of our great actor members, joined in 1944. Our current president, Sir Tim Rice, and our previous president, Sir Tom Stoppard, had a couple of hits on the stage as well, as did a very long-standing member of ours and a great friend and supporter, David Hare, who I'm delighted is on our panel this evening. And another great friend of the library and non-standing member, of course, Michael Billington, who is chairing tonight. I'm going to let Michael introduce the panel, but I'm going to introduce Michael, otherwise he'll be too polite to do that himself. For anyone who's had any passing interest in the theatre at any point in the last 50 years or so will know the name Michael Billington and will have read many of his reviews, countless number, I'm sure. He has been the drama critic at The Guardian since 1971. He has been a regular presenter on BBC Radio for culture programmes. He has written extensively on the theatre. As the authorised biographer of Harold Pinter, he was critically acclaimed. In 2007, he won the Theatre Book Prize for his book, The State of the Nation, the British Theatre since 1945, I think was the title. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Michael and our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. We're here, as you know, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Theatres Act, which ended the Lord Chamberlain's power of theatrical censorship. But I think there are lots of other questions we can explore tonight. Why did the Lord Chamberlain's arbitrary power exist for so long? Did it have a cramping effect on writers and prevent certain subjects being tackled? And above all, is censorship alive and kicking today in other forms? For instance, restrictions because of economics or our fear of offending certain religions. Anyway, to discuss these issues and others, we've got a superbly qualified panel. On my extreme right, I speak geographically, not politically, Professor Steve Nicholson, who is Professor of 20th Century and Contemporary Theatre at Sheffield University and has written a 4-volume study of the censorship of British drama from 1900 to 1968. So he is a living authority on the subject. David Hare, next to him, is one of our most prolific and popular dramatists. And by my count, David, your 18th play for the National Theatre, is that correct?
Yeah.
It's about to open any day now. It's called I'm Not Running. It starts previewing next week. And David has rushed today from the rehearsal room. He also started out as a dramatist at the very moment when censorship was being demolished and is therefore one of the beneficiaries of the Theatre Act.
Indeed.
And next to me is Alexis Zegerman, is an actor. I should say actor, not actress, shouldn't I? Do you mind?
I'm unbothered.
Don't
Yes.
bother. Okay. Actor, actress, and a dramatist whose current play, Holy Shit, is running at London's Kiln Theatre. And it's a play which raises issues to do with race and religion that might once have stimulated the Lord Chamberlain to get out his blue pencil, I suspect. And as well as working as an actor, Alexis has had plays produced at Hampstead and the Royal Court, and has an upcoming film called, am I right, The Lover's Guide to Rome, which sounds very tantalising. We'd like to start by just putting the whole subject in context. So Steve is just going to read a few passages from the parliamentary investigation into censorship, is that right?
And some extracts from some of the Lord Chamberlain's reports.
Extracts from the Lord Chamberlain's report. So this is the raw material of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So Steve, can I hand over to you for the opening?
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. So yes, what I'm going to do is just try and say in as summary a way as I can how censorship operated under the Lord Chamberlain, and then just read a few, not quite random, but just a few small examples of some of the correspondence. So the censorship system by the Lord Chamberlain has directly political origins. In 1737, the Prime Minister, Walpole, was fed up with being criticised from the stage, so he introduced and passed this law that henceforth all new plays, before they could be performed in public, had to be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain for licence, and the Lord Chamberlain had the right to refuse a licence or to make any changes that he wanted to. And some of the odd things about that is the Lord Chamberlain had complete control. There was no appeal against his decisions. You could write to him, and sometimes he replied, but he wasn't obliged to. He didn't have to give you any reason for why he was refusing a play or cutting certain things. Again, he often did, but he wasn't obliged to. So he had complete authority, and there were no absolute rules that he had to follow. So obviously Lord Chamberlains do vary. They have their own particular subjects that they get upset about. It was all new plays written after 1737. That included new translations. So if you were staging a translation of Oedipus, which was banned for quite a while, or Lysistrata, the Greek comedy, you could have played it in the original Greek, but if you wanted to play it in English in the new version, you had to get a license for it. The Lord Chamberlain always claimed not to be a censor. He saw himself as a licenser rather than a censor. Perhaps censors always do. He liked to say that there were many things that playwrights could write about without getting into trouble. Why did they have to introduce these particular few subjects that he objected to? So he saw himself as a licenser. Now, relatively few plays were completely banned. What was much more common was that he would demand certain cuts. It might be particular lines, it might be particular characters, it could also be stage directions, costumes that he had control of. He was working from a script that was sent to him before performance, so he didn't go and see the performance. He sent a script, but he included stage directions in it, and sometimes, and anybody who's had any involvement in theatre will know how ridiculous this is, he sometimes insisted that any stage action and any stage business needed to be included in the script. So if you did something on stage that wasn't just an action or a gesture that wasn't in the script, you could be taken to prosecution for that. Sometimes lots of changes were made. He had this phrase that he used when he really didn't like a play but didn't want to draw attention to it by banning it completely. He had this phrase, death by 1,000 cuts. In other words, if you make enough little changes, the writer and the manager will probably withdraw the play and not bother to go ahead with it. No improvisation was officially allowed on stage. We'd just been having a conversation about whether that sometimes happened. And of course, one thing we don't know, is whether actors always kept to the script, because he didn't have an effective way of policing it. And presumably, if he did find out, you could always say, oh, sorry, I forgot we'd cut that line. Mistake. So we don't know how absolute it always was in practice. Another odd thing about it was, because he was the head servant in the royal household, plays that were licensed were seen as having the approval of the monarch. They were officially approved by the monarch. That's important because, for example, I think one of the most surprising, disturbing, shocking things that I remember finding out was that all the way through the 1930s, you were not allowed to put on a play critical of Hitler or of the Nazis because, according to Lord Chamberlain, the Germans would conclude that you were expressing the opinion of the monarch. So the playwright wasn't just expressing their own opinion. If it was licensed, it was seen as the monarch's opinion. So in fact, what he used to do through the 30s was send plays to the German embassy in London. He had that wasn't part of the law. He had no official right to do that. But he did send them to the German embassy for them to say whether they approved of something or not. There were some ways around, and we might talk more about it later on, there were some ways around the censorship. One was that there were private clubs, and there was a convention that the Lord Chamberlain didn't have control over private clubs. So you could put something on. Usually it would just be perhaps on Sunday nights without a full performance. Actually, it turns out the law didn't allow that, and the Lord Chamberlain should have been controlling clubs as well. But he talks about it as a safety valve. Oh, we'll let them do it in a club. Even then, there are writers who talk about, but we know we mustn't go too far in the private club, because if we go too far, then they'll change the law and come down on us. I suppose one of the other things that censorship shows is how important the theatre was seen to be. In the early 1900s, an MP who wanted stricter censorship stood up in Parliament and said, young people get most of their ideas from what they see in the theatre. Therefore, we need to control it more strictly. You might find this hard to believe, but in the 1920s, Lord Chamberlain's office were worried that Noel Coward plays were going to encourage a Soviet-style revolution in this country. Seriously, they were. They said, Noel Coward's plays are showing the British ruling class as being decadent and taking drugs and being adulterous, so people will think, why should we take any notice of them? Let's have a revolution. And some of Noel Coward's plays were banned. We tend to think of them as being probably very safe and old-fashioned, but that's how important the theatre was seen to be.
Steve, could I just ask you a question at this point?
Sure.
Why did the system last so long? Why did it survive until 1968?
It survived because it was there and nobody could be bothered to do anything about it. The Lord Chamberlain himself, for the last 15, 20 years, wanted it to stop, or at the very least, he wanted to get rid of the responsibility for it. He couldn't get governments to do anything until Harold Wilson's government, Roy Jenkins, Home Secretary, took it on and said, we will change
But
it.
Shaw, Granville Barker, that generation were actively campaigning against the Lord Chamberlain, even then, weren't they?
Yep, there were lots of campaigns against it, and there's a government select committee in 1909, and lots of playwrights attacked it, including, and I think this is interesting because it raises the issue of self-censorship, there were writers, novelists. Arnold Bennett, I know he did write a bit for the theatre, but he said to that committee, I won't write for the theatre because as soon as I get close to what I want to say, I think of the Lord Chamberlain and I know it will be stopped. So there's a whole issue of self-censorship and people who didn't write plays. There's quite an interesting playwright in the 30s called Hubert Griffith who talks about the unborn plays, the plays that writers might have liked to write but hadn't written. Because if you're trying to make a living as a writer and you know that certain things aren't going to be allowed, what's the point of, you're wasting your time an effort.
Yeah. Can we come back to the history in a moment? I'd just like
Sure,
to
absolutely.
carry on the discussion and take it on to another stage, because David, you, as I said, came into the theatre as an active playwright at the very moment when the Lord Chamberlain's powers were being demolished. Even after that, were there still forms of censorship? Were there plays that had difficulties, that didn't get on, that got pulled? I mean, did censorship die in 1968, or did it carry on in other forms, do you think?
Well, I want to talk about 4 productions which illustrate the differing forms censorship now takes, and what lesson I drew from each. So in 1977, I co-produced Wallace Shawn's play, A Thought in 3 Parts, for Joint Stock Theatre. Of the 3 one-act plays, the middle one is set during an orgy at a youth hostel, and is both hilarious and, I think, the only successfully realised orgy I've ever seen on a stage. It became the subject of debate in the House of Lords and was condemned from the front bench by the government of the day. The ICA, which in those days was a producing venue for radical theatre, was told that if it extended the run of the play, which was naturally packed out, it would lose its Arts Council grant, and the ICA gave in and closed the play. So what did I learn? This was my first lesson in censorship. What did I learn? I learned never rely on politicians to understand anything about art, because the 2 cultures are completely different. In 1987, I was on the board of the Royal Court Theatre when Max Stafford Clark intended to stage Jim Allen's play, Perdition, which claimed that certain members of the Jewish leadership in Hungary had collaborated with Adolf Eichmann in the Holocaust. The play was programmed, directed by Ken Loach, and then cancelled on the morning of its first preview in response to concerns about its truthfulness. And Max Stafford Clark later said that the 2 worst decisions of his life were, first, to put the play on, and second, to take it off. And what lesson did I learn from that? If you know you are walking towards enemy fire, you must be 100% sure of your own ground. In my experience, censorship rows, and I'm thinking about Salman Rushdie, I'm thinking of the television film Scum, which was made by the BBC, then never shown, and I'm thinking of Mary Whitehouse's farcical prosecution of the Romans in Britain. They're all dirty wars from which almost nobody ever recovers. The director of Scum, Alan Clark, who posthumously became one of Britain's best-known filmmakers, said the hardest thing about being banned was not to let it become the defining event of your life. The third of my examples, in 2004, my friend Jonathan Church, then director of the Birmingham Rep, had the unenviable job of having to cancel performances of the play Dishonour by Gurpreet Kaur Bhatti, because he said he could not guarantee the safety of his employees in the face of violent protests from Sikhs, furious that the play represented scenes of rape and murder inside a Sikh temple. This seems to me much the most serious violation of free speech in the British theatre in many years, since it proved that physical intimidation could work and be extremely effective. And in 2015, by the way, similar arguments about personal safety were used to prevent the production of the play Homegrown, about the radicalisation of young Muslims by the National Youth Theatre. When Vincent Nichols, the Catholic Archbishop of Birmingham, said that dishonour, and I quote, demeaned the sacred places of every religion, what was the lesson I learned? Never rely on religious leaders to understand anything about art. The 2 cultures are completely different. And finally, there was the disturbing moment at the end of 2017 when Vicky Featherstone, the director of the Royal Court, cancelled scheduled performances of Andrea Dunbar's Rita Sue and Bob 2. Now, she said that it would be inappropriate for the theatre to present a play which 30 years previously had been developed and directed by Max Stafford Clark, who at the time was being accused by a number of women with the sexual abuse of his position. Stafford Clark had also directed the present production for the first 3 days of rehearsal before being sacked as artistic director of Out of Joint for his behaviour. I was only one of many people who protested the censorship of Andrea Dunbar. I know for sure that Carol Churchill and Richard Eyre both joined me, pointing out that Andrea, a working class writer from a Bradford council estate, knew rather more about abuse, sexual, social, and economic, than the people who wanted to silence her. She writes as tellingly as any contemporary dramatist about the effects of that abuse. In the face of this opposition, Featherstone climbed down after 48 hours. Now, what did I learn on this occasion? I learned that memories are very, very short. When William Gaskell, the director of the Royal Court, had to turn the theatre into a club in 1966 in order to present Edward Bond's play Saved, he was faced in the magistrates' court with the possibility of being sent to prison. It was, Bill said, the defining moment of his life. And he also said nothing in his life was ever as interesting again. He never got away from it. It was another dirty war from which a participant never recovered. How on earth, in a mere 50 years, had we travelled to a point where an artistic director of the Royal Court of all theatres did not see freedom of speech as an absolute good? When I was trying to work out my reaction to the Royal Court's original decision, then I formulated my own convictions thus, which perhaps, Michael, you can discuss, which is, to what question exactly is censorship ever the right answer?
Thank you, David, very much. We've heard from Steve about the historical origins of censorship. We've heard from David about the recent examples, or examples over the last 50 years. Can I come to you, Alexis? Because you have grown up, I assume, in a post-censorship world, haven't you?
I like to think so.
But do you feel the sort of, I don't know, the invisible hand of censorship ever on your shoulder or
Yes.
not? Or do you feel absolute freedom to write whatever you wish?
Well, both, I think, is the answer to that. So, as Michael pointed out, I've got my play Holy Shit on at the Kiln Theatre at the moment. I wasn't even sure if we were allowed to say the word shit.
Or
I'm
kiln.
just saying it, or kiln. But there we are. And in fact, the I in shit, I'm just going to keep saying that word, I do apologise, became an upside down exclamation mark, and that had nothing to do with me. That was a marketing choice from the marketing department, because what they discovered is when you do the mail outs, which everything's now done via email, the word shit wasn't getting through people's emails, so through the firewall. So actually the name of my play had to change without me having anything to do with that whatsoever. I'm just going to do a little anecdote from 20 years ago, where, David, you did a masterclass at the Haymarket. You just done Via Dolorosa, actually. It was probably just less than 20 years ago. And there I was, brimming with the possibility of being a writer. Very excited. I was just at drama school at the time, and you opened out to questions, and a lady in the audience put her hand up, and she asked you a question. She said, Mr. Hare, my daughter writes wonderful, brilliant plays, but they don't go on. What can she do? And your response to her was, well, if she writes brilliant, wonderful plays, they will go on. And off I went, full of that, full of promise and excitement. And I was asked to join the Royal Court Young Writers Programme and Payne's Plough. And then we come to a survey that was done in 2014, the most recent survey on British theatre, which showed us that 8% of plays that produced by professional theatres, 8% of those plays were written by women. A tiny fraction of percentage were written by people of colour. So I would love to say that if you write a brilliant play in this country right now, it will go on. But the truth is, if you are a woman or a person of colour daring to write, your play is much less likely to go on than if you were a man. And that is, that's been proven to us. So there I was on the Royal Court Young Writers Programme, probably a 50-50 sort of gender makeup of men and women, a very healthy smattering of writers of colour. They were all brilliant. We all shared work. We all went out into the world full of hope with our great plays. And unfortunately, the women and the people of colour on that group largely haven't emerged. A lot of the men on there are great writers, and a lot of them are great friends of mine. But unfortunately, that is the grim thing that we are looking at as writers of my generation, that we are still fighting to have women who represent not just 50% of the population, but 65% of people that go to the theatre. We're just not, the voices are being gagged. So yes, I do think censorship still exists. We can go on and talk about why that is.
We will. I mean, I want to talk about censorship today and the various forms it takes. I'd just like to go back to Steve for a moment and the historical context, because one thing you touched on very briefly, I'd just like you to expand on it. What seemed to me most absurd about the Lord Chamberlain's office in my lifetime was the hypocrisy of the club system. And I can remember going to see, I think, John Osborne's page for me at the Royal Court. You went up, you didn't just buy a ticket, you said you were a member of the English Stage Society. I think you even paid some token sum of 5 shillings. And for that, you were somehow purified and sanctified and allowed to go and be contaminated, possibly, by John Osborne's play about gay life in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, it was the rank, nonsensical absurdity of it that hit me, and the stench of hypocrisy when I first came to London. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean, it was a deliberate safety valve. The Lord Chamberlain saw it as a safety valve. It goes back, I think, to about the 1880s, 1890s, when Ibsen was first staged in private clubs in this country. Pirandello was staged in Italian in a private club because that was all right for people who spoke Italian, but you couldn't put on 6 characters in search of an author in English in a public theatre because of the theme of incest that's in there. So yes, it was hypocritical. It's smashed really in the 1950s when, we were talking about this earlier, the Tennessee Williams Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and Arthur Miller's View from a Bridge were refused licenses by the Lord Chamberlain for public performance because of the sexual material. View from a Bridge has one moment where 2 men kiss. Now, traditionally, British writers actually, if the Lord Chamberlain objected to something like that, they'd just say, oh, we'll cut that out. Williams and Miller, and then increasingly other writers in the 60s, like Osborne, said, no, we're not going to change it. So the Williams and the Miller plays were put on in what was called a private club, the Watergate Theatre Club, but they took over a major West End theatre, the Comedy, I think it was. They ran there for 6 months, audiences of, I don't know what it held, 2,000 maybe a night. There was no difference between that really and a public performance. And from that moment onwards, you might say the writing's on the wall for the Lord Chamberlain. It's the same thing as then the Royal Court does in the 60s, as you said, saying, okay, well, we'll turn ourselves into a private club. The Royal Shakespeare Company threatened to do it with the Aldwych. They said, okay, in our repertoire, the nights when we're doing this play will be private, the nights when we're doing that play will be public. And clearly it is just a ridiculous, it's exposed as a ridiculous system.
Good, I'm glad we nailed that, because that seems to be one of the worst aspects of the Lord Chamberlain's ridiculous position. Let's go on then with censorship in our lifetime, whether it exists in other forms. Can I offer various definitions of censorship today? One would be economic censorship. If you write a play, and you, practicing playwrights, you both know this, if you write a play with more than 10 characters, your chances of getting that play produced are reduced. You may get it done at the National Theatre, you may get it done at RSC, nowhere else. In other words, austerity economics, doesn't that exercise its own form of censorship? Certain plays just don't get done because they are too expensive. David? Your plays do get...
You should say.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, well, okay. Obviously, I've got a bit of a drum to beat here, but
Okay,
it
beat.
wasn't until 2008 that a play by a woman was put on at the Olivier Theatre.
Mm-hmm.
That was Rebecca Lenkovitz's Her Naked Skin, but it took that long to get a large-scale play on by a female playwright. So, yes, absolutely, I agree with you. As a sort of, you know, youngish writer, I probably wouldn't write an enormous play because I know that A, there aren't that, you know, there just isn't the money to put them on, but also as a woman, I'm much less likely to be programmed in the large spaces that we have. And in fact, Sir Nicholas Heitner, of whom I'm a great fan and have worked with, I think he came out and said once that you could only be, if your name was David, Tom, or
Alan.
Yeah.
David, Tom, or Alan, then you know those are the only people that could write plays for the Olivier, and you know that's the man that was at the time running the National Theatre that's meant to represent the whole country. Again, I'm a huge fan of his. However, you know that assertion exists.
You're saying there's an active gender bias.
I think there is. I think
Even
there is.
now?
Even now, yes. It's a known fact that sort of 75% of main stage plays are by men, and women will normally always be deferred to the smaller spaces.
Are you talking about, sorry, are you taking questions from the audience?
Well, no, can we come back? Yeah, I mean, hold on to your question. We will come back to it, I promise you.
But yes, on a more general note, I would probably look at smaller casts.
Okay, but you're saying there's a gender bias, but David, wouldn't a male dramatist who also wrote on an epic scale have difficulty getting his play onto a public stage?
It's difficult for me because it is changing, and it is changing more dramatically in the last 10 years than it's changed in my lifetime. I don't think I can offer any defence. There was an attempt, you know, and one of the paradoxes of the, you know, of what has happened to Max Stafford Clark is that Max Stafford Clark in the 1980s is the director who most tried to create a generation of female playwrights at the Royal Court, and who positively had a system of preferential treatment to women dramatists with exactly a quota and a statistical aim. I can only say three things. One, that most of the plays that I go to now that I enjoy are by women. Secondly, that I think 7 of the 10 most popular plays, most performed plays in America last year were by women, statistically, according to American Theatre. I've just been involved in a exercise to elect 40 new fellows to the Royal Society of Literature. And that was in all fields. In other words, that was poetry, that was fiction, that was biography, that was non-fiction, that was screenwriting, that was theatre. And without any attempt or any, I don't think any of us ever mentioned the subject of gender once. But 79% of the new fellows we elected were women. And so clearly something really exciting is going on. And those of us who are lucky enough to see the plays are glad it's going on at last. Those of us who've spent our lives representing women in the centre of the stage were mystified, or I was mystified for 40 years, why everything that I was trying to do, nobody took the slightest notice of. You know, everybody said to me, oh, it's so wonderful you're writing all these wonderful female parts. For 40 years, I said, yeah, but it's having absolutely no effect whatsoever on the British theatre. Why that was, I cannot begin to understand.
Do you think things are changing?
I certainly hope so, but slowly. And the National Theatre have committed themselves to 50-50 gender parity on male to female writers by 2021. And at the moment, this year they were at 28%. So that's not bad, but that's one theatre. It's one theatre. And you know, we were just speaking about this slightly earlier. And the important thing is, and as David's pointed out, is that there isn't the theatrical canon of women that I follow behind.
No.
So
Right.
all of that takes time to build, and it feels eternal when you're sitting in my seat. But when you say it like that, it sounds like things are moving. But from where I'm sitting, it all feels very, very slow. And in fact, Steve, we were just saying earlier, I asked Steve if any of the readers in you know, people that were going through the censorship were women, and of course they weren't. They were sort of ex-military men. I mean, can you only imagine if they'd received a play written by a woman at the time called Holy Shit?
It was a male. It was a male establishment, the Lord
Was it
Chamberlain's
male?
office.
It was. I mean, he had an advisory board for a while in the 20s and 30s, and Lady Violet Bonham Carter was one of a member of the advisory
titled lady,
board.
yes.
But that
Yes.
was unusual.
Yeah.
Can I steer us on? We'll come back to economics, but onto religion, because that seems to be still one of the difficult areas to tackle for any dramatist. What about the history of this? I mean, have plays about religion always been subject to censorship by the Lord Chamberlain, or were they always subject?
They were. The last absolute ban that he had was on the portrayal of Christ on stage, and that that lasted until 1966, and that included, and there are examples of completely conventional, pro-Christian plays written by vicars and priests that he wouldn't allow, that were trying to reach out to a younger audience and interest them in Christianity. He consults with the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1966, and they agree to lift that absolute ban. One of the things I always say when I'm talking, particularly with students, about theatre censorship is in Britain, is important though I think it was, nobody lost their life for it. There are things around now where clearly writers risk their lives if they say.
Is it also true that Henry Irving was offered the chance to play Muhammad? Is that true?
I don't know that one. It rings a bell, but I don't know the details of it. I mean, there was a big row in the 30s about a play which had a black, an American play called Green Pastures that had a black god, in fact. I think there was a film of it as well. They were certainly very worried about actually they thought people would laugh at it. They thought people wouldn't be able to believe in the idea of a black god.
Well, obviously, we now accept the idea God can be represented, Christ can be represented on stage, but when we get into the Sikh religion, as the play David mentioned proved, that can be contentious. Islam is a difficult subject. I noticed the Royal Shakespeare Company last week was very nervous about doing a version of Tartuffe in which the hypocritical hero is in fact a Muslim. Are we nervous still about putting religion on stage?
Well, the problem is I'm not a journalist, I'm an artist. And so I can't explain to you how an artist thinks. They don't think they have a sociological duty to cover the waterfront, and why don't you write a play on this subject, and why don't you write a play on that subject? I thought it was a really shitty argument when Simon Gray said of Jerry Spring the opera, oh, it's not very brave to attack Christianity, why aren't they attacking Islam? That would be brave. To which the answer is, the artists who made Jerry Springer wanted to write about that subject. I've heard the same about the Book of Mormon. I've heard people say, oh, it's not very brave, the Book of Mormon, he's only attacking Mormons. But the fact is, they find Mormons funny. So because they find Mormons funny, they thought they could probably make a commercial entertainment out of it, which I did actually think was absolutely hilarious. I went to see it, I thought it was hilariously funny. You don't have a moral duty to go out and about looking for subject matter. That's not how an artist thinks or works. And indeed, in this area, self-censorship is something I rather speak for, is something I rather believe in. And self-censorship means I've always admired very much Cartier-Bresson. In 1944, women who were believed to have collaborated with the Nazis in liberated Paris were stripped of all their clothes, and then their hair was shaved. And the two greatest photographers in France, Cartier-Bresson and Douaneau, both refused to take photographs of that. And they said, the mob can behave like the mob, but I don't have any duty to photograph it. It's not my business to photograph that. I don't want to photograph it, and I'm morally repelled by the idea of photographing it. Now that seems to me entirely legitimate self-censorship, because that's the right to exercise your own criteria as an artist. I've been involved in 2 films which about contemporary anti-Semitism or Nazism. And in both cases, producers have asked me to include flashbacks to the camps. I won't do it. I just think it's disgusting. I won't watch anything which tries to hitch a ride on people dressed up in striped pajamas, contemporary actors pretending to be in concentration camps. No, I don't want to see it. Because my moral horror at that, and I'm not including, obviously, Munch, and I'm not including Spielberg, who are people who are actually looking at it straight in the face, but I am including filmmakers who try to hitch a ride on the imagery as being not only my artistic and my moral senses about this are aligned. On both films, I said I'd walk off if we had flashbacks to people in pajamas. And my reasons are both artistic, meaning I am not good enough to make those sequences work. I'd have to be a really great writer to make a flashback to a concentration camp inoffensive in a commercial film. And secondly, I morally don't want to do it. And it's very interesting how often your moral and artistic sense as an artist actually align. They become the same thing. I've never seen a work of art which successfully portrays the moment at which somebody agrees to become a terrorist. You know, you always have these scenes where people are going to the mosque and they meet a bad person in the mosque, and the bad person in the mosque says, but wouldn't it be wonderful if you were willing to die for Islam? And then there's a sort of terrible elision, there's a terrible click to the next scene in which, you know, the person who's newly converted is suddenly going off and killing people. And you know that moment it's certainly beyond me to dramatise. I've never seen it successfully dramatised, so you keep off that moment. And that's called self-censorship, because you are not worthy. You don't believe you can guess at something as enormous as that, and that guessing about it is somehow slightly offensive. So that kind of, you know, it's not our job to go out like journalists and just write about everything. That's not the job.
No, I was suggesting you did. I'm not saying that the artist has a duty to write about anything under the sun except what he or she chooses. And obviously, as you say, the artist has a right, the privilege of self-censorship. But my question really is whether...
Well, you say obviously, but actually all the time people say, why aren't people writing about this? Why aren't they writing about that? And the answer is because, as with any artist, the choice of subject matter is a deeply mysterious thing. You don't know where it comes from.
But there may be certain subjects, David, and I would have thought Islam, the nature of Islam is one of them, that artists may well be reluctant to tackle. Is there any truth in that or not?
Well, I mean, you've seen my play, Michael.
Yeah,
It's called Holy Shit, and it's pretty irreverent. I don't pull the punches on it. There's a lot of things that are voiced about religion, about faith, and about race, and I think a lot of people are sitting on and would never normally necessarily say out loud in polite society, and that's really what the play is about. And I just went for it, and it takes a theatre maybe like Kiln Theatre, formerly the Tricycle, to have the balls to do it. It was also a very funny play, but it's and actually just answering something that David brought up, I take a shot at everybody, and I think as a dramatist, I made the decision to do that. I feel that it's a much better play because of that, and I'm sure there could have been another version of that where that wasn't the case. So the setup is a Jewish couple start attending church to get their daughter into a very good Ofsted outstanding primary school, Church of England school, and the fallout that then has on their best friends who are Church of England, I'll say in inverted commas, but also a mixed race couple, and the fallout that the decision to go to church has, you know, enormous consequences. What's said on stage, I mean, it gets gasps, audible gasps in the audience, and there were, you know, sometimes there's a riot, people stand up and, you know, shouting on their feet. It was incredibly exciting, and I'm pleased that I went there, but obviously there would have been a time where that couldn't have happened. And just to pick up a point on what David said, I'm not saying that all Muslim writers could do this, but perhaps if Muslim writers were perhaps allowed to tackle that, they might find that moment that you haven't seen yet in television. And I think
I totally agree.
They're not
it's
given,
going to come from a Muslim writer.
It's got to come
because
from
it
a
sure as
Muslim
hell
writer.
ain't come from Western writers.
It's got to come from a Muslim writer, and unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Yeah.
You know, the fight still continues for representation.
I mean, our whole discussion is predicated on the assumption that censorship is bad, and it was a good thing when the Theatres Act was introduced, etc., that we're all taking the obvious and correct liberal line. Can I just play devil's advocate and say, are there occasions when censorship forces the artist into oblique methods? I mean, I'm thinking of a very specific example. Terence Rattigan, as I'm sure most of you know, wrote a play called The Deep Blue Sea. Separate Tables, I'm getting my plays wrong, Separate Tables. And in one of those two plays in Separate Tables, a bogus major in a very polite middle-class hotel is found guilty of molesting women in cinemas in the afternoon. That was the version that was staged in the West End in 1953. And it was palpably a sort of coded reference to homosexuality, which could not be addressed openly in 1953 in a commercial production. Rattigan had two versions of the play. I've seen the better known one. I've also seen the original script, in which the Major's offence is actually cottaging and picking up men on the seafront. Of the two versions, infinitely the better one is the coded and the cryptic one. That is not a case for arguing for censorship, but it is suggesting maybe that often the oblique approach to a subject may be preferential. So, Steve, I mean, do you ever think artists circumvented censorship in very interesting ways?
Yes, they did, and although I made the point earlier on about you couldn't put Hitler or criticise the Nazis, the Lord Chamberlain would actually say to writers, Ruritanianise it, put it in an imaginary country. We'll all know what you're writing about, but I won't get the blame for allowing something about Hitler. And there are other subjects where he does that as well. And yes, although you of course you couldn't put homosexuality on the stage within the script, but we all know how theatre communicates through gestures and looks, and there were coded things. Everybody knew that if you had a male character who arranged flowers or wrote poetry or played the piano or had long fingers, and I'm not making those up, those are all genuine things, it meant they were a gay character. But again, the Lord Chamberlain, if anybody said, how could you allow that play? I didn't see that as there's nothing that says they're homosexual.
So the Lord Chamberlain was actually offering practical advice, was he, to playwrights?
He did sometimes.
Telling them what to do.
Yes, I mean it varies from Lord Chamberlain to Lord Chamberlain, and it varies at different times, but the bottom line actually for Lord Chamberlain is he doesn't want to bring the royal family into disrepute. If the press are making fun of him and criticising him, then he also sees that as an attack potentially on the Queen. And though I would hardly go so far as to say that if I hadn't had the Theatres Act in '68, might have abolished the monarchy. I mean, he was concerned about how much mockery there was of him, and at that time how that led on to people thinking the royal family was dispensable, disposable.
Alexis, do you ever think a coded approach is interesting, preferable?
I think there'll always be theatrical metaphor. I think it just comes, it's just in different forms. But coded messages, I just think they've obviously changed shape. But David, perhaps you're probably more qualified to answer this.
Well, you're working in a collaborative art form, and so if it's a collaborative art form, that means that a whole lot of people are going to have input. And for me, this is a wonderful thing. In other words, I adore the rehearsal room floor. And the reason I love the rehearsal room is because the actor will say to me, well, that doesn't quite correspond with my experience, or I don't believe this isn't true, this doesn't seem to me to be how things are. And that process is something that any playwright of any, there are obviously examples of people like Beckett or Pinter who just hand down a script and say, you lot are going to do this word for word and I'm not interested in any of your opinions. But most of us work in a much more collaborative way, and during rehearsal we'll discuss what the subject of the thing is, and maybe, if actors find flaws in your play, and goodness knows actors are going to find flaws in your play because that's their job, you're crazy not to listen to them, aren't you? And to respond to them. So you expect in the theatre for there to be ceaseless, what I believe Hollywood calls input, right? And that means, but you do want the input to be from people who are motivated in a good way. In other words, yes, you want all sorts of input from all sorts of directions, and you're going to get it, not least from the audience. In fact, most of all, you're going to get it from the audience. But input from someone who is politically motivated to defend the monarchy, I can't see their input's going to be very interesting. And I don't think it's going to be artistically very helpful.
I'd just like to say...
by the way, I mean, just to finish this, I can't remember a time in my lifetime when the monarchy is less mocked. It hasn't been mocked now, seriously, for about 15 or 20 years. Like, mockery of the monarchy just seems to have stopped. And I don't know why. That's a curious
Mike
phenomenon.
Lee's Peterloo, which I've seen.
Is that going to mock the monarchy?
Yes, it's going to mock
really?
the monarchy.
I mean,
You're
actually,
right.
Hamilton has a very
Yes, that's true.
has a very brilliant.
Affectionate mockery in Hamilton.
Yeah,
isn't
but
it?
I don't. It is not the zeitgeist to go for the Queen at the moment. I think you can say that.
A lot of mockery, though, actually acts as promotion. You mentioned the Book of Mormon. It's the biggest recruiting poster for the Mormons they've ever had, actually. They love it. They love it.
Yeah, but that, as we know, is an argument that is produced against all satire, which is that it converts people. You know, Carol Churchill, when she wrote Serious Money, was accused of glamorising the City of London and turning people into a generation of investment bankers. But I really don't think that was the effect of the play.
Before we open it up to the audience, which will, I'd just like to come back finally to this question, which I think is fascinating, of invisible censorship today, or less palpable censorship. Does it still exist? And we mentioned several possible areas. And you mentioned gender, and I've got a feeling it does exist in the area of misogyny. Now, in other words, if you write a play today with a character who is palpably misogynist, you're either not going to get your play on, or it's going to have very limited circulation. And I would argue there are plays from the past that are not getting revived because this word misogyny hangs over the character. Look Back in Anger is a classic case, actually. It's rarely seen this day because it doesn't meet the sexual standards of today's behaviour. Do you think there's something in that?
No, I don't. I mean, I think. Sorry,
Go on.
I think it's something like Rita, Sue, and Bob too.
Right.
Which was a great case in point, which is you have to have the right people writing the plays about the misogynists, and those plays should absolutely go on because misogyny is not going anywhere. It still exists. The fact that it's just been called out is a great reason why we should.
Could I give you a very concrete example? The plays of Strindberg do not get done in the United States.
Right.
Why? Because Strindberg is regarded, I think with some justice, as a misogynist writer. His plays do not get seen. That is censorship, though it's not called censorship, isn't it?
No, I know, but let's have a Hedda Gabler that's actually written by a woman. It's not about a woman that just goes mad because a man's decided to make her go mad. I mean, obviously that's very... But let's make room. Let's make room for the new, more accurate stories, and more relevant, and told from authentic voices, I think.
Well, I think that, the play Oleanna, if anybody knows the play Oleanna by David Mamet, Richard Eyre was running the National Theatre and just read it and said to me, is this a nakedly misogynist play, or am I misreading it? Is there anything more to this than just pure vicious misogyny? I read it. I just said it's pure vicious misogyny. And so Richard said, well, do you think I can reject a David Mamet play? I said, of course you can reject a David Mamet play because it's just repellent. And yet it was not called out at the time. It was regarded as a perfectly respectable piece of drama. And I sat in the audience in disbelief. And the so-called electric atmosphere that people referred to at Oleanna was sort of the electric of just woman hatred. And he got away with it. Nobody ever complained. Misogyny sailed by, and nobody said, this is a vile play. And it's still out there. I think it might be a little harder to revive at this point, but it's still regarded as an acceptable play. And it's far more misogynist than anything Strindberg ever wrote. It's just saying a woman is always... for those of you who don't know the play, it just says a woman's always faking when she claims rape.
Leaving that idea hanging, I just want to ask Steve finally, you're an expert in the history of censorship. Do you subscribe to the idea, and I think it has emerged from this conversation, that there are still forms of censorship alive today, although we call them by other names?
I'm quite sure there are, and when the Parliament decided to abolish the Lord Chamberlain's role, they never said they were abolishing theatre censorship, because I think it's Bernard Shaw says every law is a form of censorship. There'll still be the blasphemy law, the obscenity law. In fact, there were a lot of people who were worried that theatre would become more restrictive because managers and writers would be less prepared to take the risk because they'd no longer have the Lord Chamberlain's authority. They might get taken to court. So I don't think it was ever seen as something that would take away all censorship. I'm absolutely certain that it still exists. Economic, as you said earlier. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, this is a good point, I think, to open up the discussion to the audience. So if you have a question, there was a gentleman in the front row who might short-circuited, I'm afraid, very early on. Are you ready to ask the question now?
I'm just sort of curious.
Hold on, a microphone will come to you.
Just to pick up on the issue of gender bias, which I think you described as a fact. I mean, is that true across the whole of the theatrical landscape? Because I look at the commercial sector, and probably the most powerful producer in commercial theatre is Sonia Friedman, who I suspect doesn't have that gender bias you're referring to. So just, if you could
Right,
sort
yeah,
of...
well, in the commercial theatre, which you've just picked, so in 2014, when this enormous survey was done, there was one play on by a woman in the West End, and that woman was Agatha Christie. So, yeah, so commercial sector probably has, even because it's got economics involved with it, much more than the subsidised sector. They don't have to kowtow to people in terms of quotas, so it's a bigger problem, I'd say.
Yeah,
Okay, another question? There was a question in the third row, yes?
Yes, I can just
Oh, you could just wait for the microphone, sorry.
Yes, the moment might have passed, but I don't know if it's passé to say political correctness even now or not, but it seemed to have appropriated our language recently, or perhaps for the 10 years. Did that have an effect on writing, the idea of being nice and careful about language in a politically correct way?
Did that have an effect on writing? You're saying, what, being polite,
As a form of censorship, really.
courteous,
Yeah.
nice to people?
Yes,
Has
that
affected
idea
writing?
of political correctness.
No. I mean, come on.
Good.
Theatre's always been controversial, and you know the history of theatre is the history of stirring up trouble, from Christopher Marlowe and Ibsen and you know Strindberg, who we've spoken about earlier, and that's it. You don't go into playwriting thinking that 800 people who turn up to sit in a room are going to all think that they're not going to agree with everything you say. Why should they? And so, you know, it is absolutely clear that you are completely free to say whatever you want. So I can't say that I've noticed playwrights becoming more inhibited. Have you?
No.
Not in any way.
No, well, I'm very pleased to hear it. Perhaps a technical question. We talk about the Lord Chancellor. Chamberlain, sorry. Who was that? Was that a politician? Was it someone employed?
Who was the
it
Lord
wasn't
Chamberlain?
one person for 300 years, for sure.
No, I mean, they usually lasted for about 15 or 20 years. They're a royal appointment. They have lots of other duties, which they still have. There still is a Lord Chamberlain. They do things like they organise Buckingham Palace garden parties. They sometimes go on royal tours. They have responsibilities for the Queen's swans. Lots of other things, and many of them were not interested in theatre at all. That was something they wanted other people to deal with. So they had readers, they had controllers in their office. The responsibility was always the Lord Chamberlain's. He always was the one who signed the form, but he didn't read whole plays. His staff would point out to him, what do you think about this line? He would be involved in decisions, like there's a Lord Chamberlain in the 1930s who's very, very hot on any suggestion of impotence turning up in a play. He particularly objects to that, whereas others didn't. But
So a civil servant, that they were a civil servant, legally trained?
not necessarily. I mean, they were a safe pair of hands. So Lord Cobbold, who was the last Lord Chamberlain during theatre censorship, he'd just come back from being was he an ambassador in Egypt? Some role like that he had, I think, that were good at smoothing things over and being reliable.
But what specifically ended the reign of the Lord Chamberlain? What event or what move? Because you're suggesting he suicided.
Certainly from the mid-50s onwards, he was contacted with Lord Scarborough to begin with, and then Lord Cobbold, contacting Home Secretaries and Prime Ministers and saying, are you going to do something about theatre censorship? For example, could we have a system like film censorship where you rate the things as to whether different ages can come and see it? And he could never get governments they had other more important things to do, perhaps. He could never get them to act on it. I think it's really hard to pinpoint one thing. One thing I was saying to you before, and I know you don't necessarily agree with it, David, is that I think you could argue that by 1968, theatre was less important in terms of ideas and what it made people think. You know, who would say in 1968, as an MP had said in 1900, young people get most of their ideas from the theatre? There were plays being broadcast on the radio and on television, which the Lord Chamberlain had no control over, that he had refused licenses for. And that's plainly ridiculous. You know, the newspapers, people were saying to him, why, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre's Huis Clos, he'd refused a license for, it was on the radio. Lord Chamberlain said, oh, well, yes, you can't tell that character's a lesbian on the radio, whereas you can on the stage. But, you know, he knew that was a kind of ridiculous argument, really.
Who were the readers? My impression was always that the Lord Chamberlain's staff were above all military men. Is that fair? Retired military men.
His senior staff certainly were. The controller of his office, Sir Tim Nugent in the 60s, who then became president of the MCC. Yes, they were military men. His readers were, well, one reader was Sir St Vincent Trowbridge, who claimed ancestry from Lord Nelson. And he was one of the most, he was always for censoring as much as possible. And in fact, senior staff said, oh, don't take too much notice of him.
He had a one-eyed stance, obviously.
Indeed, yes. But, you know, they had a hell of a job, as I was saying to you. You know, they were reading every play that's going to be performed, whether it's professional, whether it's amateur, bunch of students, every play comes in. There's maybe 2 readers. I worked out once that the average reader was probably reading 3 plays a day if they worked 7 days a week and writing a summary of each one and identifying things that they thought might need censoring.
And getting paid?
And getting paid 2 guineas for each play if it was full length, which was what the fee had been in 1737.
Right.
It wasn't quite so much by 1960. So they were, you know, and you know, there are a couple of readers who say, I can't afford to do this, I'm going to have to take another job, I can't go on.
But do you refuse to allow heroism to those who fought the Lord Chamberlain?
No, I certainly don't refuse to allow heroism. I mean, the Royal Court fought him. Peter Hall in the RSC fought him very hard. You know, in the end, when it came to the Select Committee in 66, 67, Peter Hall and the RSC were the ones who went in saying, never mind about swear words and that sort of stuff, it's the political censorship we're worried about. Particularly, it was a play Peter Brook had directed called US, or
Yes.
Us, which was
Yes.
an anti-Vietnam war, or really about the British response to Vietnam, which in the end had been almost uncensored after lots and lots of debate, and the chair of the RSC having to go and see the Lord Chamberlain, and Peter Hall and Peter Brook being kept in the street outside till they were allowed in, and the American ambassador being involved and so on. And I interviewed Peter Hall, and he said he was genuinely worried that he would lose his job as, whatever it was, artistic director of the RSC at that time, I think. He didn't. The play went on almost unchanged, but it was, and look, the Lord Chamberlain gave evidence to the committee saying, yes, there are some other political plays in the pipeline at the moment. And I think it was that was probably what persuaded the most MPs that we're not just talking about whether you can say fuck on stage, we're actually talking about, you know, basic political, important political censorship that carried the vote.
If my memory is correct, Harold Wilson, then Prime Minister, wanted to retain the censorship, right? Is that fair?
He certainly did.
Not
to
least
begin
because a
with.
play called Mrs. Wilson's Diary was playing in the West End at that time,
That's
lampooning
right.
the Admirable Mary Wilson. Yeah.
That's right, and had lots of other Labour politicians. George Brown
showed
if
as
you
a drunk,
him,
I remember,
as
yes.
a
Unbelievable.
drunk. And a play with, of all things, a crazy American president who decides to drop a bomb on Britain because they don't support his foreign policy. And they're so incompetent that they drop it on Greenland instead.
Wilson wanted to keep the censorship, but Roy Jenkins presumably...
Roy Jenkins drove it, yes, and an MP called Strauss, I've forgotten his first name, George Strauss. And Michael Foote was very, very strong on it as well.
Sorry, there's two questions. Oh, yes, Peter.
No, I just wanted to say, I think I was in the last play that was closed by the Lord Chamberlain, because I was in the original production of Early Morning at the Royal Court.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yes.
Right.
And I'm just listening to your discussion. This isn't really a question, but I was just thinking about it. We rehearsed the play for with Bill Gaskell for 2 months or something. And then we did 2 performances. And it wasn't like being in a flop. It was a sort of terrible coitus interruptus that sort of left you feeling that the whole thing was kind of totally pointless.
Could you just enlighten people who may have forgotten why that play caused such offence?
Well, it caused offence because there was a scene in it, or was a large part of the plot, when Queen Victoria and Florence Nightingale had a bit of a lesbian what's-it. But it was a kind of... I mean, I think it's so long since this happened, and I can't say I've read it again, and I haven't seen it again because it's never done. But I think it's rather a brilliant play. It was a sort of fantasy. It was a sort of something Alice in Wonderland about it. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I just wanted to say that I was censored.
Presumably the performances you gave were private ones at the Royal Court, because it was the last play he refused a license to, because it also has that scene in heaven. The third act is in heaven, and the royal family are all eating each other as cannibals. You couldn't have written a play more likely to upset the Lord Chamberlain. Now, I interviewed Edward Bond, and he insisted that he didn't do it deliberately to upset the Lord Chamberlain. But just the other thing I'd say about that, I think it's a wonderful example of how you couldn't put anything nasty about Queen Victoria on the stage. Well, if you know that, who's going to write something critical of Queen Elizabeth if you know you can't say something about Queen Victoria?
Is a question on the front row, yes?
You mentioned resistance and fighting the Lord Chamberlain and things. In '63, a former member of this library, Beckett's publisher, John Calder, staged the infamous Nudity on stage up in Edinburgh, and they were all members of the Travers Theatre Club. He passed away just 3 weeks ago. But my question is, there was something about you couldn't have nudity on stage if the person was moving, and they cryptically dissected this and they wheeled her across on a cart. Yes. Interesting, still of note today, but my concern and question is to you, is that effective, those types of resistances to censorship today? Do you see that type of avant-garde still effective in the days of this big media? And is the theater and the paths to it so institutionalized that this type of thing might not work anymore? A true, grassroots. We don't have spaces in central London for theatre clubs that we can afford these days, type of thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know. Resistance to what? I mean, what are we resisting?
Censorship. To censorship as it exists today, which I do believe it does.
I don't know. Is the theatre still oppositional, resistant?
Well, what you're talking about is a period of particular anarchy, wasn't it? It was a period of artistic anarchy in which there were, and believe me, I attended many, many such evenings. They were evenings that essentially that were more like events, and which owed as much to Duchamp as they did to George Bernard Shaw. In other words, there was very little that you would recognise as being what was called a play, and instead there was a sort of anarchy on the stage. That kind of evening is still very popular in the European theatre, and is still, those kind of deconstructions of plays in which mere fragments of plays are presented and then the rest takes the form of something closer to performance art. That's very, very popular in Germany, very popular in Poland. It's less popular here. And I quote the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art. Obviously, in the 1970s, it had to have a performance space. If it was to be the Institute of Contemporary Art, it had to have something called theatre, however loosely you call it theatre, because to be at the cutting edge of art, you had to you had to have live performance. I don't think the art world now feels that, and the two are very separate. I did argue when Sirota founded the Tate Modern, and it was obviously going to have such a transformative effect on how people saw modern art, then I argued to him that he should try and move the National Film Theatre in there. And I thought it would have a hugely regenerative effect on film culture in this country, which is still, stuck in a tiny, tiny little time warp and corner under Waterloo Bridge, And I think if they'd moved another art form out into Tate Modern and brought that massive new audience that there was for the visual arts to cinema as well, it would have been really liberating. But he said it was too much for him to take on. He had enough on his plate already.
Yes, the Nude Lady in 1963, wasn't it? It was at the Edinburgh Festival, and it was a conference, and it was built as a happening, wasn't
Charles
it?
Marovitz
Charles
was
Marovitz.
behind it.
And she was wheeled across on a wheelbarrow.
In a wheelbarrow.
If my memory serves.
Lord Chamberlain had nothing to do with it, but he was written to and asked whether he would have allowed it, and he said
Yes.
Lord Chamberlain would definitely not allow a nude woman to be wheeled across the stage in a wheelbarrow.
But it is true, isn't it, that at the Windmill Theatre, nudes were permissible as long as they did not move.
As long as they didn't move, yes, yes, that's right.
The audience could move, but not the ladies, yes.
Yes. Yeah, and there's long debates in the Lord Chamberlain's office about how you define nudity, actually, which you might have thought was obvious. And I can tell you that I have never seen so many photographs of nude women as I've seen in the Lord Chamberlain's files, because they had to send in pictures of the women in poses, and he used to initial across their thighs if he approved it. And whether he approved it sometimes depended on their bust size. He would say, I will allow a woman with these breasts, but I wouldn't allow a woman with larger breasts.
Well, you've confirmed something I've always thought, which is the corrupting effect of censorship on the censor. I mean, it's not what it does to us, it's what it does to them that is so terrifying.
Yes, and I'm almost certain that some people in Lord Chamberlain's office used to go to the Windmill Theatre and watch the reviews. In fact, there are reports, you wouldn't believe this, but the one of the people in his office who used to go and see them, his name was Titman, George Titman, wonderfully, and he writes this wonderful report where he goes and there are all these new women, and he says in his report afterwards, I didn't know why when this new woman appeared, everybody around me moved to seats further out to look from different angles, because clearly they could see different things from different angles.
I think on this highly elevated note, we should probably bring the discussion to an end. But I mean, I would just like to thank all the participants. I don't know whether there's any broad conclusion to come, but I think one sort of undercurrent to our discussion this evening has been that although, as you said, the Theatres Act in 1968 ended the Lord Chamberlain's power, the word censorship is never quite going to go away, and it just manifests itself in other forms, in different cultures, at different times. So thank you, Steve, thank you, David, and thank you, Alexis, very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much.